Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, summer 1984. Lieutenant Commander Nigel Sharkey Ward stepped down from the cockpit of an 899 Naval Air Squadron Sea Harrier FRS.1 onto tarmac that shimmered at 40 degrees Celsius, unbuckled his bone dome, and was told by a USAF colonel that the exercise program had been quietly rewritten overnight. The Americans wanted the British jump jet flown in mixed engagements against the F-15 Sea Eagles of the 57th Fighter Weapons Wing, home of Red Flag and the USAF Fighter Weapons School. Ward had brought 2 aircraft, a handful of engineers from British Aerospace at Kingston, and the recent memory of the South Atlantic, where 801 Naval Air Squadron had claimed a run of Sea Harrier kills against Argentine Mirages, Daggers and a 4 Skyhawks without loss in air-to-air combat. The fleet air arm arrived at Nellis with a small aircraft, a single Blue Fox radar of modest performance, and the AIM-9L Sidewinder that the Reagan administration had released to Britain during the Falklands Campaign under intense pressure from the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defense. What the fleet air arm did not bring was any expectation of losing. Ward, who had led 801 from HMS Invincible during Operation Corporate, and would later publish a bitterly candid memoir, believed the Sea Harrier's VIFing capability, vectoring in forward flight, a phrase coined at Boscombe Down in the late 1960s, gave a trained pilot a decisive edge at close quarters. The Americans, flying an aircraft nearly 3 times heavier with a top speed above Mach 2.5, regarded the encounter as a courtesy. Their briefing rooms carried squadron patches from Bitburg and Kadena. Their pilots had trained against aggressor F-15s painted in Warsaw-packed colours. Several had flown against Israeli crews returning from the Bekaa Valley shoot-down of Syrian MiGs in June 1982. On the Nevada ramp, the Eagle looked like a different species. The first sortie was scheduled for one-on-one basic fighter maneuvers over the ranges north of Indian Springs. Altitude block 12 to 24,000 feet, guns and heat seekers simulated, radar missiles restricted. The rules of engagement, drafted jointly by USAF and Royal Navy staff officers, permitted the Sea Harrier to use vectored thrust freely. The American squadron commander briefing his pilots that morning is reported by Ward and by later USAF oral histories to have told them the Harrier would be dead before the merge. Ward, walking to his aircraft with his wingman Lieutenant Steve Thomas, another Falklands veteran from 801, said only that they would fly as they had over Pebble Island. The engines lit with the characteristic howl of the Pegasus 104. The nozzles rotated through the transition, and the 2 grey jets lifted off in a hover and go that drew a small crowd from the maintenance hangars. Within 90 seconds of the first merge, at roughly 15,000 feet over the desert floor, the lead F-15C called a simulated Sidewinder kill on Ward, who had already snapped his nozzles down through 80 degrees, decelerated the Harrier to under 150 knots, and watched the Eagle's belly slide across his gun sight. Ward called Fox 2. The range controller confirmed the shot. The debrief that evening at the Nellis Officers Club was silent for a long time, before the American colonel walked over to the small British contingent, ordered a round of drinks, and asked what precisely they had just seen. The Sea Harrier at Nellis in 1984 was the product of decisions taken 20 years earlier in rooms along Whitehall, and it is not possible to understand the Nevada dogfights without following those decisions. In 1966, the Wilson government cancelled the CVA-01 fleet carrier program, a decision announced to the Commons by Defense Secretary Dennis Healey on February 22nd, and one that the first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir David Luce, resigned over within days. The Royal Navy lost at a stroke its planned successor to the Ark Royal and its long-term claim on fixed-wing fast jets. What survived the cull was a small Ministry of Defence research line at Kingston upon Thames, where Hawker Siddeley engineers under Sir Sidney Cam had been developing the P.1127 vectored thrust demonstrator with Bristol Siddeley's Pegasus engine. The RAF Harrier GR.1 entered service in April 1969, welcomed by Air Chief Marshal Sir John Grandy as an aircraft that could disperse from cratered airfields on the North German plain. The Navy watched, waited and lobbied. In 1975, with the through-deck cruiser program now approved as a means of preserving anti-submarine helicopter operations against Soviet boats in the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, the Callaghan government authorized the Sea Harrier FRS.1 at a unit price kept deliberately low by Treasury pressure. The specification was written by the Directorate of Naval Air Warfare and reflected a Cold War problem set: intercept Soviet Tu-95 Bear D maritime reconnaissance aircraft shadowing the fleet, attack surface ships with Sea Eagle missiles, and provide limited combat air patrol against MiG-23s that might reach the North Atlantic from Kola. The Blue Fox radar was a Ferranti derivative of the Sea Spray fitted to Lynx helicopters, chosen because a full multi-mode radar would have doubled the aircraft's cost. Test flying began at British Aerospace Dunsfold in August 1978 under John Farley, the chief test pilot, whose demonstrations of VIFing at Farnborough left visiting American admirals visibly reconsidering their assumptions. The first operational squadron, 800 Naval Air Squadron, commissioned aboard HMS Invincible in April 1980. 22 months later, Argentine forces landed on the Falkland Islands. The Sea Harrier's Cold War design brief did not include a war of national survival in the South Atlantic against French-built Mirage 3s, and daggers flown by pilots trained in Israel and the United States. What it did include, almost by accident, was a set of characteristics: small radar cross-section, low wing loading, the Pegasus and its vectoring nozzles, and, after 1981, a hard-fought Foreign Office negotiation to obtain the all-aspect AIM-9L Sidewinder from Washington. That translated with brutal efficiency into close combat over San Carlos water in May 1982. 28 Sea Harriers deployed with the task force. They flew over 2,000 sorties in 6 weeks. 20 enemy aircraft were destroyed in air-to-air engagements. None of them lost to enemy fighters in return. 6 Sea Harriers were lost, 5 to ground fire and accidents. The Fleet Air Arm returned to Yeovilton with a combat record that American naval aviators, watching from the desks of the Pentagon's Office of Program Analysis and Evaluation, could not easily explain. Invitations to Nevada followed within a year. What the Americans wanted to know was whether the Falklands result was the aircraft, the pilots, the missile, or the enemy. The Royal Navy proposed to demonstrate the answer. The Royal Navy contingent that arrived at Nellis in 1984 was, by American standards, absurdly small. 2 Sea Harriers, roughly a dozen air crew and engineers from 899 Naval Air Squadron at RNA-S Yeovilton, and a liaison team from the Naval Attaché's office at the British Embassy in Washington. The Americans provided the airspace, the range instrumentation, the aggressor pilots, and the beer. Ward has recorded the exercise program in some detail, and his account is broadly corroborated by USAF debriefing summaries, later released under Freedom of Information requests, though several of the specific score lines remain contested by American participants. The initial phase pitted Sea Harrier against F-15C in 1 versus 1 basic fighter maneuvers, altitude blocks between 10 and 25,000 feet, guns and short-range missiles simulated by range calls to Red Crown at Nellis. The Eagle's advantages were transparent: twice the thrust-to-weight ratio at combat power, an APG-63 radar with look-down shoot-down capability, and the AIM-7F Sparrow for beyond visual range shots. The Sea Harrier's advantages were less obvious and, to the American pilots, initially invisible. Subsonic in level flight, radar limited to short range and carrying only 2 sidewinders and 2 30mm Aiden cannon in under-fuselage pods, it possessed one capability that no other Western fighter shared. The pilot could rotate the 4 Pegasus nozzles from horizontal to below vertical while in forward flight, decelerating the aircraft at rates that no conventional airframe could match, and pointing the nose independently of the flight path. The technique developed at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down in the late 1960s and refined by Fleet Air Arm pilots at Yeovilton was formalized as vectoring in forward flight, VIFF or VIFing, and remained restricted information within Western Air Forces until the Falklands compelled a partial declassification. Ward's first engagement, described in his 1992 memoir, Sea Harrier over the Falklands, and in unclassified USAF post-exercise briefings, ended with the Eagle overshooting a decelerating Harrier and being called dead by the range controllers. The second, third, and fourth ended similarly. American pilots, taught to keep speed high and maintain energy in the vertical, found themselves committed to overshoots against an aircraft that could effectively stop in mid-air. Attempts to disengage in the vertical produced sidewinder shots into the tailpipes. Attempts to force the fight into the horizontal produced snapshots from the Aden pods. The Nellis debriefs from that first week, according to accounts subsequently confirmed by RAF Air Warfare Center historians at Waddington, recorded a lopsided result within visual range that the American command found genuinely alarming. Colonel John Jumper, later Chief of Staff of the USAF and, at the time, a senior officer in the Fighter Weapons School, is reported by several sources to have flown at least one sortie against the British aircraft. His debrief remarks have not been publicly released. The classified American report on the exercise, portions of which later surfaced in professional journals, including the Naval Institute Proceedings, concluded that the Sea Harrier represented a genuine threat within roughly a mile of an F-15, and recommended that USAF pilots avoid close combat with the type where operationally possible. The Royal Navy, which had spent the previous decade defending the aircraft's small numbers and modest specification against Treasury skepticism, took quiet satisfaction from the finding. In London, the Ministry of Defence Directorate responsible for naval aviation circulated the American conclusion internally without comment. It was, one desk officer later recalled to Peter Hennessy, the most useful piece of paper the Fleet Air Arm had received since 1966. The strategic context that made the Nellis exercises matter reached from the pier at Portsmouth to the offices of the Joint Intelligence Committee in the Cabinet Office, and it was not principally about air combat. Britain's Cold War maritime posture in the 1980s rested on a single proposition. In the event of war with the Warsaw Pact, the Royal Navy would keep the sea lanes of the North Atlantic open long enough for American reinforcements to reach the Central Front in West Germany. That mission, formalized in NATO's Saklant plans and in the UK's contribution to Supreme Allied Commander Europe's General Defence Plan, required the Navy to hunt Soviet submarines in the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, to protect convoys against backfire bombers armed with AS-4 Kitchen missiles operating from Kola, and to sustain the deterrent patrols of the Polaris Force from Faslane. The Sea Harrier existed to protect the ships doing that work. The Invincible-class through-deck cruisers, of which HMS Invincible commissioned in July 1980, followed by Illustrious in 1982, and Ark Royal in 1985, were designed principally as anti-submarine platforms, carrying Sea King helicopters with sonobuoys and Stingray torpedoes. The Sea Harriers embarked in small numbers to keep Bear Ds at arm's length, and to deter any attempt by Soviet fighter cover to interdict the anti-submarine effort. This was, by the standards of American carrier aviation, an extraordinarily modest capability. The Nimitz-class carrier operated 90 aircraft, including 2 squadrons of F-14 Tomcats, capable of engaging targets at over 100 nautical miles, with the AIM-54 Phoenix. The Invincible operated 8 to 12 Sea Harriers, with a radar effective to perhaps 20. Yet the Nellis results suggested that, within visual range, the smaller aircraft could hold its own against anything the Warsaw Pact was likely to put in the air. That mattered because Soviet naval aviation in the 1980s was transitioning from the Yak-38 Forger, a marginal vertical takeoff aircraft operating from the Kiev-class cruisers, to whatever came next in the naval fighter line, the aircraft that would eventually be designated Su-33. The Sea Harrier's ability to defeat American fighters flown by American pilots on American ranges suggested that against Soviet aircraft flown by Soviet pilots, the odds were substantially better than the Ministry of Defense had assumed when it costed the Invincible program in 1973. The first Sea Lord in 1984, Admiral Sir William Staveley, made the connection explicit in a memorandum to the Secretary of State for Defense, Michael Heseltine, in November of that year. The Sea Harrier's demonstrated performance, Staveley argued, justified investment in the Sea Harrier FA.2 upgrade program with the Blue Vixen radar and AIM-120 AMRAAM, then under study at the Defense Research Establishment at Malvern. Heseltine engaged in a running battle with the Treasury over the 1984 defense estimates, and simultaneously fighting the Westland affair that would end his career at the Ministry of Defense within 15 months, accepted the argument in principle. The upgrade program was formally launched in 1988, and the first FA.2 aircraft entered service in 1993, after the Cold War had ended and the strategic rationale for the aircraft had begun to erode. Whether the FRS-1's performance at Nellis contributed to that decision is not documented in the released cabinet papers. Serving officers who worked on the FA.2 program have argued in interviews with Lawrence Freedman and others that it plainly did. The paper trail is thinner. What is not in doubt is that the Nellis exercises entered Fleet Air Arm folklore, and that they did so while the Cold War still had 6 years to run. The Americans came to Yeovilton in the autumn of 1985 for the return match. The 33rd Tactical Fighter Wing from Eglin Air Force Base in Florida detached a small number of F-15 Sea Eagles to RAF Coltishall in Norfolk, from where they operated against 899 Naval Air Squadron in exercises conducted over the North Sea and East Anglia. The rules of engagement agreed between the USAF European headquarters at Ramstein and the Ministry of Defense included beyond visual range engagements using simulated AIM-7F Sparrows, which the Sea Harrier could neither carry nor defend against with any degree of confidence. The Blue Fox radar, adequate for detecting Bear Ds at low level over open sea, was substantially outclassed by the APG-63 in an air-to-air role. When the Americans could establish and maintain a radar picture, they killed Sea Harriers at ranges of 20 miles or more before the British aircraft could detect them. Ward's own account is candid on this point. In the beyond visual range phase, the Fleet Air Arm was outmatched, and the exercise scores reflected it. The visual range phase, however, produced a repeat of the Nellis results. Once the fight closed inside 3 miles, the vectored thrust advantage reasserted itself, and 899 squadron pilots, including Lieutenant Commander David Braithwaite and Lieutenant Simon Hargreaves, recorded consistent gun camera footage of F-15 tailpipes at ranges under 500 yards. Squadron leader Chris Golds of the RAF Central Trials and Tactics Organization at Boscombe Down, who observed several of the debriefs, produced an internal report for the Air Warfare Centre, concluding that the Sea Harrier's close combat performance was superior to any Western fighter then in service, including the F-16 and the Tornado F-3. The report was classified secret and not released until the mid-1990s. What the exercises demonstrated in aggregate was a set of trade-offs that the Ministry of Defense had understood since the 1975 procurement decision, but had never before been able to quantify. The Sea Harrier was a short-range interceptor and close combat fighter of exceptional capability, embedded in a fleet air arm that could not project it far and could not defend it beyond visual range. Against Soviet Bear Ds and backfire bombers over the North Atlantic, both operating without fighter cover and dependent on their own defensive armament, the aircraft was more than adequate. Against a peer air force operating fourth-generation fighters with medium-range radar missiles and airborne early warning, it was survivable only at close quarters. This was, in Cold War terms, an acceptable answer to the strategic question the Ministry of Defense had asked in 1975. The Soviet Northern Fleet's air component in the 1980s consisted principally of Tu-95s, Tu-142s and Tu-22Ms, none of them air-to-air threats. The Yak-38 deployed on the Kiev-class ships was regarded by the Defense Intelligence Staff as effectively no threat at all. The Nellis and Coltishall exercises confirmed that the Fleet Air Arm's small force of Sea Harriers could reasonably be expected to hold the ring against the Soviet threat as it actually existed, rather than the threat that American carrier air wings had been designed to defeat. That conclusion, quietly disseminated within the Naval Staff and the Joint Intelligence Committee, shaped the debate over the Sea Harrier FA.2 program, the through-deck cruiser force structure, and ultimately the 1998 Strategic Defense Review's decision to replace the type with the Joint Strike Fighter. In 1985, however, all of that lay in the future. The immediate result of the Coltishall exercises was a series of quiet toasts in the wardroom at Yeovilton, and a growing conviction within the American fighter community that the small British aircraft deserved more respect than it had received. The pilots who flew the Sea Harrier through the Cold War were an unusual community, and the fact of that community shaped the aircraft's operational performance as much as the airframe itself. The Fleet Air Arm in the 1980s numbered fewer than 300 fast-jet aircrew, drawn from a Royal Navy that had been contracting in size since the late 1960s, and that competed with the RAF, British Airways, and the City of London for graduates capable of flying a Sea Harrier from the ramp of an Invincible-class ship at night in a Force 7 North Atlantic gale. The training pipeline running through Cranwell for basic training, RAF Valley for advanced fast-jet training on the Hawk, and then RNAS Yeovilton for Sea Harrier conversion with 899 Squadron, produced roughly 20 new frontline pilots a year. The community was small enough that every operational Sea Harrier pilot knew every other operational Sea Harrier pilot, and the informal transmission of tactics between squadrons and generations was correspondingly intense. Ward himself had learned VIFing from John Farley, the Dunsfold test pilot, in a series of informal flights arranged through the Society of Experimental Test Pilots in the late 1970s. Farley had learned it from Duncan Simpson and Bill Bedford, the original Hawker test pilots on the P.1127. Bedford's first vertical landing at Dunsfold on October 21, 1960, was recorded in a short handwritten note in the Hawker test log, now held at the Brooklands Museum. The tactical exploitation of the technique developed by pilots like Ward, Thomas, Braithwaite and Hargreaves at Yeovilton in the late 1970s and early 1980s was passed on in briefing rooms, at squadron dinners, and in the small hours of the morning after formal debriefs had ended. This is a form of institutional knowledge that does not appear in aircraft specifications or in Ministry of Defense procurement documents, and it is very difficult to reproduce. The American pilots who flew against the Fleet Air Arm at Nellis and Coltishall were individually at least as capable as their British counterparts, and in some respects better trained. USAF fighter weapons. School graduates flew more sorties per year, had access to more sophisticated instrumentation, and benefited from a larger community of experienced instructors. What they did not have was the specific accumulated knowledge of how to fly a vectored thrust fighter in close combat, because the F-15 could not vector its thrust. When the Sea Harrier community deployed to the Falklands in April 1982, it took with it not only the aircraft but the tactical doctrine that made the aircraft dangerous. The result over San Carlos Water and Pebble Island reflected both. The 1984 and 1985 exercises against the USAF were in effect a controlled experiment. The same pilots, the same tactics, the same aircraft, against a different enemy on different geography. The result was consistent. Historians including Nigel Ward and Christopher Andrew have noted that this pattern, a small British force with disproportionate operational effectiveness derived from tightly held institutional knowledge, was characteristic of the Cold War Royal Navy more broadly, and was replicated in the submarine service's hunt for Soviet boats in the Barents Sea, in the Special Forces operations against Warsaw Pact targets rehearsed at Hereford, and in GCHQ's SIGINT effort at Cheltenham. The Sea Harrier's Nellis performance was, in this reading, less an aviation story than an intelligence story. The accumulated tactical understanding of a small professional community, deployed against a larger and better resourced adversary, and generating results that the adversary had not predicted. The Ministry of Defence understood this. The Treasury characteristically did not. Signals from the Nellis exercises reached the Soviet Naval Air Command at Severomorsk within months, though the mechanism by which they did so has never been publicly established. The KGB's first Chief Directorate maintained an extensive collection effort against American defense establishments in the early 1980s run against contractors around Nellis, Edwards and the Pentagon procurement offices. Vasili Mitrokhin's archive, smuggled out of Moscow in 1992 and passed to MI6 through the Riga station under conditions of extreme secrecy, contains references to Soviet interest in the Sea Harrier program dating to 1979, when the FRS.1 first flew, and intensifying after the Falklands. Christopher Andrews' authorized history of MI5 and his subsequent work with Mitrokhin note that Soviet naval aviation studies of Western VSTOL aircraft in the mid-1980s drew explicitly on unclassified American after-action reports of the Nellis exercises, supplemented by human intelligence of uncertain provenance. What the Soviets concluded is a matter of speculation. The Yakovlev Design Bureau's work on the Yak-41, a supersonic vectored thrust successor to the Yak-38, intended for the Ulyanovsk-class carrier, then under construction at the Nikolaev shipyard, accelerated in 1985 and 1986, and the aircraft first flew in March 1987. Whether this acceleration reflected Soviet reading of the Nellis results or independent design pressures is not clear from the released materials. The Yak-41 was cancelled in 1991 after the collapse of Soviet defense funding, and the Ulyanovsk was scrapped on the slipway. Design data from the program was subsequently sold to Lockheed Martin and contributed to the F-35B Lightning II, the aircraft that eventually replaced the Sea Harrier in Royal Navy service. This convergence of British, Soviet and American vectored thrust programs, each drawing on the other's work in ways that remain partly classified, is one of the odder legacies of the Cold War's final decade. The immediate British interest, however, was in what the Nellis exercises revealed about NATO's air power in a general war. The Joint Intelligence Committee's assessments of the Warsaw Pact air threat in the mid-1980s, later analysed by Percy Craddock and Peter Hennessy in works drawing on partial declassification, treated the Sea Harrier as a supporting element in a broader NATO air-to-air posture dominated by the F-15, the F-16, the Tornado F.3, and the French Mirage 2000. The Nellis results complicated this picture. If the small British aircraft could consistently defeat the Eagle within visual range, then the balance of visual range combat over the Central Front in a hypothetical war was less favourable to NATO than had been assumed, because Warsaw Pact fighters, the MiG-29 in particular, which had entered Soviet service in 1983, also possessed high thrust-to-weight ratios and were designed for close combat. The RAF's Air Warfare Centre at Waddington, established in 1993 partly in response to lessons drawn from Fleet Air Arm experience, would spend much of the 1990s working through the implications. In 1985 and 1986, however, the immediate British concern was more practical. How to sustain the Sea Harrier community through a period of severe defence budget pressure, keep the through-deck cruisers at sea, and preserve the tactical knowledge accumulated at Yeovilton against the day when it would be needed. Nigel Ward retired from the Royal Navy in 1986, disillusioned by Ministry of Defence procurement decisions that he judged incompetent and by senior officers whom he accused in print of institutional cowardice. His memoir, published in 1992, remains controversial within the Fleet Air Arm. The tactical knowledge he embodied was passed to his successors, and through them to the pilots who took the FA-2 to sea in the 1990s and to Kosovo in 1999. Britain's Cold War ended in Fleet Air Arm terms, not with a treaty or a ceremony, but with a slow drawdown that began around 1989 and accelerated after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact in 1991. The Sea Harrier FRS.1 remained in frontline service through the Options for Change Defence Review of 1990, under which Defence Secretary Tom King reduced the Royal Navy's frigate force by roughly a third but preserved the 3 Invincible-class ships and their embarked air groups. The strategic rationale, Soviet submarines in the North Atlantic, dissolved between 1989 and 1991 as the Soviet Northern Fleet returned to port. The Bear D patrols ceased and Russian naval aviation entered a decade of collapse. The Sea Harrier survived the transition because the type had, by then, acquired new missions in the Adriatic, over Bosnia in 1993 and 1994, and eventually over Sierra Leone and Iraq. The FA.2 upgrade program launched in 1988, partly on the strength of the Nellis exercises, and the FRS.1's Falklands record, entered service in 1993 with the Blue Vixen radar and AMRAAM, giving the Fleet Air Arm the beyond visual range capability it had lacked at Coltishall in 1985. The tactical community at Yeovilton, sustained through the drawdown, adapted the type to post-Cold War missions and preserved the vectored thrust close combat knowledge that had unsettled the American fighter community a decade earlier. In 2006, the Sea Harrier was retired from Royal Navy service without replacement, a decision taken in the 2004 Defence White Paper and defended by the Ministry of Defence on grounds of cost. For nearly a decade, the Royal Navy operated without a fixed-wing carrier fighter until the F-35B entered service aboard HMS Queen Elizabeth in the 2020s. The lineage of vectored thrust that ran from Bedford's first hover at Dunsfold in October 1960, through Farley's Farnborough demonstrations, through Ward and 801 Squadron over the Falklands, through 899 Squadron over Nevada and the North Sea, and through the FA-2 over the Balkans, terminated in a foreign aircraft partly designed with Yakovlev data purchased after the Soviet collapse. The Nellis exercises of 1984 occupy an oddly specific place in this history. They were not a decisive strategic event. They did not alter the Cold War balance. They did not directly cause any procurement decision that can be traced through the cabinet papers held at Kew. What they did was demonstrate in front of American witnesses whose subsequent testimony could not be dismissed, that a small British aircraft procured on a tight budget and flown by a small community of naval aviators could defeat the premier American air superiority fighter in the environment for which the American fighter had been designed. This was, in Cold War terms, an unusual British result. Successive defence reviews since the 1950s had accustomed Whitehall to the idea that British capability was at best a supplement to American power. The Fleet Air Arm's experience at Nellis suggested a more complicated picture in which specific British capabilities, tightly held and skillfully applied, could produce operational results that the American establishment had not anticipated. The Ministry of Defence characteristically did not publicise this. The Fleet Air Arm remembered. The pilots who flew at Nellis, now in their 70s and 80s, still meet at Yeovilton reunions, and the story of the summer of 1984 is told in the wardroom in tones that combine professional satisfaction with a certain wry awareness of everything that has been lost since.